Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter is the brilliant debut novel from Lizzie Pook, an award-winning journalist and travel writer who lives in London. After spending time in northwestern Australia researching the South Sea pearling industry, Lizzie was inspired to write this novel. A novel which not only explores the origin of this treacherous yet alluring industry, but a novel about family, about loss, redemption and second chances, and above all, a novel about a woman who would go to any lengths to save someone she loves. A gorgeous novel which had me aching to head back to Broome and immerse myself in the natural beauty and history of a truly remarkable region in this vast country of ours. And here with me today to chat about her book is the talented Lizzie herself. Welcome to the podcast, Lizzie.
Hi, Claudine. Lovely to be chatting with you. Thank you for that very generous introduction.
Not generous at all, very well deserved. And I wanted to say congratulations on the publication of your debut novel, which incredibly was released simultaneously in Australia, the UK and the US. How marvellous.
Thank you. Yes, it's all been very exciting and a bit of a whirlwind. So it's out in Australia now, it's out in the UK now, and actually US and Canadian publication is in June. So It's been so it's a long sort of drawn out process of launching around the world, but it's really nice, and it's been really lovely to get messages from out in Australia and here in the UK as well. So yes, all very exciting.
Oh, that's wonderful. And so it has been out for a while now in Australia. How are you feeling? Are you still in that kind of pinch me mode?
Yeah, I think it was interesting because, as you mentioned, I do live in London. And so when it came out in Australia, I couldn't go and see it in the bookshops or anything like that, or meet readers face to face or anything. So there was this slight sort of disconnect with my book, this thing I'd worked on for years, being out and available in Australia, but I couldn't actually see it with my own eyes. But it's been really, really nice to have loads of messages on social media, people sending me pictures of it in their local bookshops, and just message. I've had some really lovely messages from people whose family were involved in the pearling industry, and they wanted to get in touch and say, oh, thank you for writing a book about this, and we felt it was really important that you told this story, so that was really lovely. And also my main character is loosely inspired, I would say, by a real woman called Eliza Broadhurst, and her great-great-granddaughter got in touch with me and said that she'd picked up the book and seen her great-great-grandmother in the acknowledgements, and that she was taking it away with her on holiday to read. And really, that was just so lovely, and I think I can't hope for anything better than that. So it's been really nice, slightly surreal, and also slightly exposing. It's really, there's something so vulnerable about having a book out in the world, especially something that I've worked on for years. This was a research process that took years, but also something that has just my heart and soul in it. So it's been lovely to get such a good response.
Oh, how wonderful. You said something a little bit earlier that I just want to touch on. It is an important story, I think. And we were just talking a little bit about that before we started recording. It's a story that documents, as you said, British Australian shared history. And I think a story that Australians really do need to read. But more than that, I think your descriptions of the northwest of Australia, the landscape and the weather were so atmospheric that I could feel the oppressive humidity of the air. I could smell the mud from the mangrove swamps, and I could see the colour of the sky as the storms rolled in. So much so that I was convinced that you must have been from the area, someone who grew up in the region, seeing the landscape in all its guises, along with the array of plants and animals that inhabit it. Even your characters' encounters with the various marine life had me enthralled. So I wanted to ask you, Lizzie, how was it that you were able to write so convincingly about this area?
Thank you for saying that. That's really kind. I do wonder, because before I was an author, I was a travel writer. And so I spent my life traveling around the world and had to convey sense of place and what it was like to be in a particular environment, often in only a few hundred words. And so when you're doing that, you have to really try and transport the reader immediately. So it's really kind of, you can say to say, but I can only assume that it's partly linked to that, and to always trying to have sense of place in everything that I write. But I did spend quite a lot of time out in that part of Australia while I was researching this book. I was lucky enough to be able to go back out a few times, specifically to sort of the Kimberley and Broome and Cape Leveque and those parts of the world. And I'm also a very visual writer, and I take a lot of video. I even took sort of audio, just sort of soundscapes of things like birds or the ocean, or just whatever sounds like it. Yeah, whatever sounds I could pick up with my phone when I was traveling. And so back here in the UK, when I was doing much of the writing, I plastered my walls with all sorts of pictures of the landscapes or early settlers in that part of the world, or as you know, marine life, wildlife, things like that. So writing for me is a very sensory experience, and hopefully that translates to the page. But also when you're, you know, I love that part of the world. It fascinates me. I'm just completely obsessed with it. And I think when you have that fascination as a driving force, hopefully that sort of comes through on the paper, because, you know, it really is such a Broome in that part of the world, it's a cliche to say, but it's an assault on the senses. You know, it is really, can be stiflingly hot. The colors are almost obscenely bright, and so it really is a very, very OTT experience being there. And so it was nice to be able to bring that to the page.
Well, you absolutely have succeeded in doing so. And as I said, it made me long to go back. So, yeah, well done you on that. Absolutely beautiful. So, Lizzie, for those who haven't read Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter, could you tell me a little bit more about the story?
Yeah, so Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter is a historical mystery set against the backdrop of the dangerous pearl diving industry in 19th century Western Australia. Our protagonist is Eliza Brightwell, a young, strong-willed British woman whose family has sailed across to the remote community of Bannon Bay to set up in the lucrative pearl shell industry. But when Eliza's father, Charles, the eccentric captain of a pearling lugger, goes missing from his ship while out at sea under suspicious circumstances, it falls to Eliza to uncover the truth of what's happened to him. And as she sort of scours the streets of Bannon Bay and the seas beyond, she uncovers corruption, prejudice, and lots of long buried secrets.
I mentioned briefly, and so did you, that you'd spent time in northwest of Australia doing research. But what was the seed of inspiration that sent you down the path of writing Eliza's story?
Yeah, so there were two parts basically that ended up dovetailing, and the first was when I was driving from Perth to Darwin with my twin sister, and we ended up at the Maritime Museum in Fremantle. And in that museum was a little exhibition, quite tucked away, about a family of British settlers called the Broadhursts, who'd sailed across to Shark Bay in WA, and the father had tried his hand at pearling, not pearl diving, pearling. He was a master pearler. That intrigued me. I didn't know much about this industry at all, and the idea of the British family sailing over, you know, taking that months-long sail to do that was intrigued me. But the matriarch of that family was a woman who I mentioned earlier called Eliza Broadhurst. And she was quite formidable, actually. She was, you know, we would call her a feminist now. She was an early feminist. She subscribed to feminist literature. She survived shipwrecks and storms and set up a school in the outback. And so that just interested me. And that family stuck in my head for years and never really left. But it was only when I ended up in Broome and learned more about this fascinating, dangerous, brutal, oftentimes exploitative industry of pearling and pearl diving that I just became completely hooked. You know, it really sparked an obsession, and I knew I wanted to write more about this part of the world, because in the mid 19th century, Broome would have been a total anomaly on Australian soil, in that people from all over the world descended on what was a tiny sort of red dust township, people from America, Asia, the Caribbean, Europe, all to sort of try their luck and their fortune in finding pearl shell. And I was just wanted to explore what it would have been like to live in that part of the world, and also have a bit of a deeper look at this industry, which I think can appear perhaps romantic on the surface. And, we look at a string of pearls and they're incredibly beautiful. And we see the pearling luggers, the ships that were used to sort of take the crews out and dive for shell. And it appears a sort of lovely, adventurous, romantic thing. But that was not the case. This was an incredibly dangerous industry. In its early stages, Indigenous people were kidnapped and forced to dive for shell. It was a form of slavery in its early stages. Then as it shifted, and the fabric of the people who made up the crews changed slightly, and the hard hat diving suits were introduced, it was still incredibly dangerous, and men would descend to the bottom of the sea in their heavy sort of copper helmets and their lead-weighted boots, and they would come up against sharks, crocodiles, sea snakes, or even whales, and their air pipes could become entangled in the flukes of whales, and they could be dragged through the water until they drowned. Or countless people succumbed to divers paralysis, which we know of as the bends. And so those two ideas basically came together: a British settler family with a strong-willed woman at its centre, and this, what I felt was a fascinating, slightly unexplored industry and shared sort of British-Australian history as well. So those are the two starting points, and it went from there.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. I think you explore the danger and the treachery of the pearling industry incredibly in this book. I mean, you just talked about some of the dangers that pearl divers faced. And in the book, you're describing quite some detail, one horrifying encounter between a pair of humpback whales and two of the Bright Wells divers. What research did you have to do to bring those accounts to the page?
I read a lot of 19th century adventure fiction while I was writing this book. And interestingly, there were very, very few women in any of those books. It was just men everywhere doing dashing, brave things. So I used lots of those sorts of books for my inspiration, and wanted to put a female character at the centre of all that. But I was really lucky in that there were some very, very useful books that I got my hands on actually by chance. There was a book that I came across in a secondhand bookshop in Fremantle. It's called Port of Pearls by Hugh Edwards, and it's about the first 100 years of Broome. Really, I just picked that book up by chance on a trip, thought it looked interesting, bought it, did not realise how incredibly useful that book would be, in that it just details all of these stories of what the divers came up against, how Indigenous people were treated, just the mechanics of the diving industry as well. That was so fascinating. And then there was another book that I came across in the Kimberley bookshop in Broome called Beyond the Lattice by Susan Sickert. And again, that just had so many interesting stories about the inhabitants of Broome. And it was really a case that while researching this book, truth was stranger than fiction. The stuff that I was actually reading was fascinating. And so there was one account of divers coming up against humpback whales in that sense. And I thought, well, that is just absolutely fascinating. I have to fictionalize that for my book. And so I was really lucky in that there were just so many incredible anecdotes that I was able to sort of use them for my story in a fictionalized way, but I had such a rich seam of research to use.
Now, Eliza was a fascinating character. I mean, she was someone who was not content to be a woman of her time, someone who bucked society's expectation of women. And to some extent, she was forced to comply for her own safety in many instances. But she didn't capitulate easily, did she?
No. And this is where the woman who inspired her actually came in that she is now seen as a very modern sort of woman. And so I didn't want my heroine to be too modern and just completely out of place, because I also think this is interesting where one of her friends in the book, the character of Min, reminds her that actually sometimes in order to get ahead, you do have to acquiesce and you do have to almost play men at their own game and, accept that you are going to be sort of pushed into certain situations, but you can manipulate those situations as well. So I did want to have a female character who didn't adhere to what was necessarily expected of her at that time, but I also wanted to make her realistic too. But I also needed Eliza to have a very strong driving force and a reason for her to be acting in this way. And that's where the themes of sort of loss and grief come in, because Eliza and actually lots of the characters in this book are propelled through the story by loss. You know, there are characters in the book who have lost family members, but also lost land, lost liberty, lost identity, lost sense of place and belonging. And I really wanted to explore how that can push people to put themselves into situations that they wouldn't necessarily have had the ambition or drive to put themselves in otherwise. And so that is why I think she acts how she does, because she's lost so much already and there's so much at stake. So, you know, the stakes really had to be so high for her to be acting in this very sort of unconventional way.
You mentioned earlier that the industry was not only treacherous, but it was quite exploitative and corrupt. So tell me about the people who were employed by master pearlers like Eliza Brightwell's father.
It varied. In the early stages of pearling, which would have been in the 1850s, 1860s, in around Shark Bay and places like that, divers weren't employed, they were kidnapped and forced to dive. So that would have been Aboriginal men, women, and even children in the early stages. You know, there were some truly horrifying stories that I uncovered, particularly in that pearlers would sometimes purposely impregnate the women because they felt that pregnant women had increased lung capacity and could therefore dive deeper and longer for shell. So this was slavery. In the early stages of pearling, it was slavery in everything but name. As it evolved, and slightly later on when my story is set, it was indentured labour that was used. So that they were crews that were sort of imported from Japan, China, parts of Indonesia. And the crews were very diverse, multicultural. Some pearlers treated their divers well, and many of them didn't. And so that was something I wanted to explore as well. I don't think it's necessarily always the case that things are black and white and good and bad. And so that is really what I wanted to explore in this book, the grey areas, the morality of it. You know, Eliza loves her father, but her father is involved in this industry and she has to come to terms with that during her search for him. And that's something that I felt was really important to explore as well, because that relates to all of us and all of our history. In that white settlement of Australia was horrendous and terrible and invasive, and we have to explore that part of our history. I think it's something that we have to interrogate, and I don't think that we should shy away from something because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And that is really something that I wanted to explore with this book.
I came across a term, you know, I think it was in your author's note at the back, which I hadn't actually heard of before, but I mean, it relates to what you were actually just talking about. The term was blackbirding. And so that was the practice that you just referred to then of kidnapping.
Yes, blackbirding is just another term for kidnapping. Yeah. So in the early stages, the pearlers would show up with guns and chains, and they would force people to come with them and dive for shell. And they'd be, some of them even used almost like slave islands, in that they would corral Indigenous people on these islands, and then they would sell them off to, you know, there were people who actively went out and found divers, and they would sell them to pearlers. It really was horrendous. But yeah, that was a new term to me as well, blackbirding. I'd not heard it, but actually, if you explore the pearling industry a bit more, it's used quite often in that sense. But yeah, just shocking.
Yeah. And I only question you about that a little bit because I think it in part explains the young character of Quill, the deckhand that Eliza employs on the lugger as she goes searching for her missing father. So can you tell me a little bit more about Quill and why that was important to her character?
Yeah, so Quill was actually based on a real person who was called Naib, but was referred to as Knife. And he was a young boy who worked as a translator for a missionary in Derby. And to Father Duncan McNabb, his name was, and he was a missionary, and he worked alongside Indigenous people on the Dampier Peninsula, and he recorded the language, and he, you know, did a missionary's work. And we know now that the missionary's work was actually quite damaging for Aboriginal communities, in that they were trying to encourage them not to use their own languages or their own cultural practices and things like that. But at the time, these communities would have almost welcomed him, because he did not want to take, they did not take from them. They did not want anything, in terms of land or women, like lots of the other white settlers. And yes, there was this young boy and I saw a little sort of exhibition about him, and I thought that was a really, really interesting character. And I also wanted to have a character, an Indigenous character, that was really active and nuanced and integral to the story as well. Because I think sometimes it can be quite easy to just write about people who look like ourselves and have the same lived experience as us. And so I wanted to reflect the diversity of places like Broome and the Dampier Peninsula. And so that's why I also worked alongside Bart Pigram, who came on board as a paid cultural consultant on the novel, and the Kimberley Aboriginal Law and Cultural Centre, who were really, really helpful, and in terms of consulting on the manuscript and the characters of Quill and Balari as well. And so that was a really, really wonderful process, in that it just added to the richness of the novel. And, they were able to point me towards particular reference books that I would find useful, or academic papers, or, have you considered this part of history and writing about this? And so it was really a really interesting and beneficial process, and made all the characters hopefully a bit more well-rounded.
Lizzie, there's so much detail, as I just mentioned, in this book. So I wanted to ask you, how long did you work on it before you decided to submit it for publication?
Well, it's interesting, because I had the idea for the book rattling around in my head for years, and it really was something, it just never left me. And I do think ideas can choose us. I think they're the ones that sort of constantly tapping on our shoulder and saying, oh, by the way, I'm still here. So actually it was a process of several years in terms of doing bits of research here and there. But actually, when it came to properly sitting down and writing the book, I would say about a year and a half. But that was around my job as a journalist. So I was writing whenever I could in the evenings, or, I even wrote parts of this book on a ship off the east coast of Greenland, in the forest in Rwanda. So I was on the road really writing this book. So it was, I would say, about a year and a half in the proper writing of it. But then I redrafted. I must have done about 15 drafts of this book to go sort of change things dramatically, kill characters off, bring characters back to life, change the ending completely. I did a draft just focusing on the weather. I did a draft just focusing on insects and flies. I did a draft just focusing on the characterization of Eliza and stuff like that. So it really was a case of just shaping it and reshaping and rewriting. So a bit of a labor of love.
Indeed, sounds like it. Did you always want to write a novel, Lizzie?
I always loved writing creatively as a child, but writing a book never seemed like a job. It was never presented as a career prospect that you could, write a book. So that is why I went into journalism, because there was, I saw lots more women journalists, just represented on TV and things like that. And so I think I always did, but it was just never something that I thought you could do. So it was only when actually I was a very busy travel writer and journalist, and I actually went through a period of ill health and was diagnosed with chronic illness and told to rest and told to slow down. Yeah. And it was actually then that I started properly focusing on the book, because not only did I have time stretching out in front of me, whereas before I'd been so high octane and busy and just focusing on sort of traveling around the world, but also I'd lost my identity as well when I was forced to take a step back from what I thought was the only interesting thing about me, my job and my career. And it was almost like, well, what do I have now? And writing this book became, the book became a life raft. I clung to it. Yeah, that's when this sort of new dream shifted into focus of writing this book and maybe possibly having this book published. So when I was editing the book, the pandemic had hit, so any travel writing stuff that I did have left disappeared overnight, like many people's careers did with the pandemic. I was not very well, And at that stage, my husband and I were living in my mum's attic bedroom. So really having this book and focusing on this book gave me a sense of purpose, and I'm grateful to it for that.
Lizzie, there are many writers who listen to this podcast, and given your incredible journey to date, are you able to offer some tips for those seeking a home for their work or those who want to write and don't know how to go about it?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the first things, which is advice that lots of people give, is to read. But I'm also quite keen on annotating my books. Because I think if you're reading a book that you're loving and you can identify what it is about that passage, that chapter, that plot twist that's really engrossing you, and you can make annotations in that book, perhaps a third of the way through your book, something has happened to turn the story on its head. If you can make a note of that and realize how that author is crafting their novel, it's a really good way of learning from the best, basically. So I'm a big advocate for making notes in margins, or if you don't want to do that, take some post-it notes and sort of stick those throughout books as well. And whether you bought the book, but essentially the advice is free after that. So that's really helpful. Also, there was a piece of advice that I heard that really did just change the way that I thought about writing. And I'm not sure if I can say the word, but it's that it was from an indie author called Shannon Mayer, and she said, "Your muse is your bitch," basically, was her phrase. But what she meant by that was that I think there's sometimes the temptation, I certainly had it when I started writing, to wait for the muse to arrive before you sit in your chair. You say, "Oh, I'm just not inspired to write today, so I'm not going to sit in my chair and do it." But actually, you sit in that chair and you tell the muse when to turn up. You tell her when she needs to be at work, and you can summon creativity just by sitting in the seat and telling it to arrive. And so when I look back on my book now, I can pinpoint the parts that were really hard to write because it felt like a slog, or I was not feeling very well that day, or I was very tired. But actually, there's no difference now between those parts of the book and the parts of the book that came more freely. So I also think there's a slight myth that good writing has to be easy. It's not. Writing is sometimes just such a slog. But if you can get through that and if you can keep going, you can edit bad prose, but you can't edit a blank page. So just get something down, get the words down. As I said, I must have done 15 drafts of this book.
Wow.
And initially I was paralyzed by the idea that what I was writing was not good, but it doesn't matter because you can make that better. The main thing you need to do is just get some words down.
Yeah, very sage advice. It's not the first, I haven't heard it in those terms before. And I love it. I think we can work with that. Absolutely. So if anyone is out there listening and wondering whether or not they're inspired enough to sit down, remember what Lizzie just said.
You need it printed on a t-shirt or something.
Lizzie, if there was one thing that you'd like readers to take away from this novel, what would it be?
I think it would be what we touched on before about grief and loss sometimes acting as a propulsive thing, because that is certainly what I have found in my life. My own dad passed away when I was 19. Eliza's 20 in this book. I don't think there's any sort of coincidence about that. But I have found that yes, there are the thorny parts of grief and the very difficult parts of grief, but it can also lead us to do things we never would have dreamed we were capable of doing because we're willing to take that risk because we've already been through loss. And so I would really love it if people felt reassured and comforted by that in this book. And yes, hopefully they will be.
Lizzie, I loved Moonlight and the Pearler's Daughter, a rich, poignant and fascinating Australian story that I recommend for lovers of historical fiction. I wish you every success with this book, and thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been lovely.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.